Hello, U.S. History students, and welcome to Unit 7, Lesson 4, the 1960s Presidencies, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. By 1960, Americans were really anxious about changes that had taken place in the 50s, mostly the beginnings of the Cold War and continuation of that, and the move for the policy of containment. The economic boom in the 50s dipped into a recession by 1960. Rock and roll music had scared a lot of parents. They saw it as immoral and against what they want their children to be. Civil rights protests really increased the fears of racial violence. Eisenhower's policies make many people in America wonder if America is actually losing the Cold War as opposed to winning it. The Soviets launched the first ever artificial satellite named Sputnik in 1957, and the Americans immediately begin to fall behind in the space race. In 1959, Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba and really scares America because Cuba is 90 miles off the southern coast of Florida, and now we have a communist leader in a nation so close to our backyard. Communism really begins to spread in Vietnam, so there's fear of an issue very similar to Korea. The use of brinkmanship and the buildup of ICBMs leads to continued fears of nuclear attacks. And then we get the U-2 incident, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. And all of these really just heighten the anxiety and the fears of the American people going into this new decade of the 1960s. The election of 1960 marks a turning point in U.S. politics. Republican Richard Nixon offers experience. He has proven himself as a politician. He serves 8 years as vice president under Eisenhower. He has foreign policy experience during some pretty particularly critical stages of the Cold War. As vice president, he really helps Eisenhower through those brinkmanship stages. And he promises in his candidacy platform to keep government spending and taxes low. This appeals to Americans because, just like today, even back then, Americans did not want their taxes raised. And government spending, if you keep government spending low, that's going to decrease the deficit or the debt that America's in. So all of these look really good to a lot of people during the 1960 election. Democrat John F. Kennedy offers youth and hope. For example, in 1960, Richard Nixon is 47 years old, whereas JFK is 43. He was a fairly well-known senator. He had served 2 terms in the Senate. He has no foreign policy experience, and he's really seen as inexperienced in general in comparison, and he's Catholic, which a lot of people really aren't so sure about in the 1960s. But he offers active leadership to address the issues that are happening in the country, and that really does bring about hope in the American people that he will be good. In 1960, we see the first ever presidential debates on television. And in these debates, we really see the difference between Nixon and Kennedy. Kennedy is wearing like a linen suit, a very light suit. He's wearing makeup, so he looks very presentable to the cameras under the really hot lights. He's planned out what he's going to say, and he has all of his points down. Whereas Nixon is wearing a very heavy wool suit, so he's really hot under the stage lights. He's not wearing makeup, so he looks kind of pale and not as presentable. And he just kind of seems flustered in this interview. The TV debates really help JFK win the election. It really turns the tide for him. And 1960 marks the beginning of TV dominance in politics. Whereas Eisenhower's the first ever televised inauguration, this is the first ever televised presidential debate, and it really does turn the tide of voters. Kennedy represents youth and charisma, hope, and a really new approach to government, and his family captivates the nation. Now, JFK is not from poor beginnings. His family has been very wealthy. He grew up with many brothers and sisters. His father was in government. So the Kennedy name is not something that is new to Americans. But JFK is this new breath of fresh air, I guess you could say. His wife is beautiful. His children are absolutely adorable. And this brings to rise what we call the era of Camelot. And it's really this very picturesque family that everybody adores. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, his wife, creates a new standards of American fashion for women. She's seen as very elegant, very poised, and her fashion is really seen as very modern, and that appeals to many of the ladies in the country who start to try to mirror her fashions. And they're not shy about letting their children be seen. And the nation adores their young children, Caroline and John Kennedy Jr., especially the photo in the top left where John, as he's called, is peeking out of a little door on the Oval Office desk and just kind of looking out and seeing what's going on in the Oval Office under his dad's feet. And these pictures are all over the place in the media, and that really helps the American people grow to love JFK and his family. JFK's vision for America is called the New Frontier. He fills out his cabinet and White House staff with the best and brightest of American political minds. And he does this because he really wants to do good. JFK wants to improve the lives of all Americans, and he's really one of the first presidents to embrace civil rights and actually fight for civil rights. After the violence in Birmingham in 1963, JFK really commits himself to creating a Civil Rights Act that's going to help make equality a reality as opposed to just a saying. And he wants to wage a war on poverty. He sees that there are many Americans that are not nearly as well off as he is, and he really wants to help close the gap between rich and poor. That Gilded Age idea of the 1% owning 99% of the wealth just is not going to do it for Kennedy. And he really wants to do the best he can to make sure that all of Americans' people are taken care of. With regards to the Cold War, JFK takes a very strong stance against the Soviet Union. He believes that the Soviet Union has much more ICBMs and better space technology. And this is actually proven at that time. They're beating us in the space race, and their number of missiles is significantly higher than ours. But he's not going to look at it from a strict focus. He wants a flexible response to fight the Cold War. Not only do we need to create more missiles or ICBMs, but we also need a bigger military. If we're going to fight this, we need to have the manpower to do it. He wants to allow the United States to have what's called first strike capability. So that means that he wants the U.S. to be able to strike first, rather than mutually assured destruction, and as Eisenhower had wanted. And up here in our personal voice, this is Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense under the Kennedy administration, and he says, "The Kennedy administration worried that the reliance on nuclear weapons gave us no way to respond to large non-nuclear attacks without committing suicide. We decided to broaden the range of options by strengthening and modernizing the military's ability to fight a non-nuclear war. And this is really the beginnings of JFK's first strike capability against the Soviet Union, as opposed to Eisenhower's mutually assured destruction. He also creates the Peace Corps in 1961, and this is kind of to combat the Cold War. The purpose of the Peace Corps, which is actually still around today, is to send humanitarian aid as well as improve U.S. relations with underdeveloped nations. So we're going to send people to really help out in Africa or the Middle East or South America, in these places where they don't have the same standards of living that Americans do. And then in 1962, JFK commits the United States to catch up to the Soviet Union in the space race. He declares that we will land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. He honestly believes that we can improve technology and Americans can come out on top. Unfortunately, he does not live long enough to see it, as we'll see later on in this discussion. But he pledges in this speech from September 12th of 1962, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too." In August of 1969, we do reach Kennedy's goal, and we land the first ever man on the moon, essentially winning the space race and beating the Soviet Union just as Kennedy had anticipated. Within his first year in office, Soviet leader Khrushchev threatens to cut off access to West Berlin. Going back to the early days of the Cold War, in order to prevent the Nazis from regaining control in Germany, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union split Germany into 4 pieces, each country taking what we call a block or a section. However, Berlin, the capital of Germany, is well within the Soviet bloc. And this actually does scare the United States, even though we do have a section of Berlin. The United States, France, and Great Britain share half of Berlin, just like we share half of Germany. And at that point, Khrushchev does not want relations between Communist East and Democratic West, Berlin. JFK vows to never give up access to West Berlin, basically saying, "You will be helped. We will take care of you." Rather than blockade the city, communist leaders build a wall. This is the Berlin Wall, and the purpose of this wall is to keep East Germans out of West Berlin, thus giving them no access to any democratic or free enterprise economy concepts. And Kennedy actually does go to Berlin in June of 1963, where he's pledging the United States support for West Germany. And he's essentially telling them, I am one of you, in his speech that is really known as one of the most famous anti-communist speeches of the Cold War. In this speech, he says, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was civis Romanus sum. I am a Roman citizen. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I can take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. Comically, Ich bin ein Berliner Essentially got jokes because it also means I am a jelly donut, because a Berliner is a jelly donut. So it became comical, but essentially JFK is saying, I am one of you. We support you. And this gives a lot of pride to the West Berliners. In the Berlin Wall, walls and other barriers 10 to 15 feet high surround West Berlin. The length of these barriers are around the city total somewhere around 110 miles. There is what we call the death strip, stretched like a barren moat around West Berlin with patrols, floodlights, electric fences, vehicle traps, and all of these other things that are trying to prevent East Berliners from getting to West Berlin, to getting to the freedom of democracy. And all of that is on the eastern side around West Berlin. And on the western side, people are spray painting graffiti on the wall and nobody's really doing anything about it. But the eastern side is very strict and very controlled, and you can't get through it. There's so many obstacles. And the Berlin Wall actually lasts until 1989. In 1959, Fidel Castro gains control of Cuba. He starts seizing property. He takes aid from Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. So this is a Soviet-backed communist nation 90 miles off the southern coast of Florida. And this really scares Americans because the whole point of containment is to keep communism from spreading. And now it has spread so close to home, and this really makes people scared. Under the Eisenhower administration, the CIA trains Cuban exiles to invade the island and overthrow Castro. This means that he's training people who have left Cuba, who don't agree with Castro or what he's doing, to go back in and invade the island and get rid of Castro. Well, in 1960, Eisenhower is no longer allowed to run for office. JFK wins, and in 1961, JFK comes into office. That same year, he authorizes a plan where essentially what's going to happen is Kennedy is going to continue what Eisenhower had started, and the CIA sponsors the rebel group Brigade 2506 in an invasion in 1961. And the whole purpose of this was to try to overtake Castro. They go in and intend to overthrow this government. Launched from Guatemala and Nicaragua, the invading force was defeated within 3 days by the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces under the direct command of Fidel Castro. And so this is really seen as an act of attack. They feel like the Americans are attacking them, which they were. So JFK sees this as a failure, which it was, because the whole point was to overthrow Castro. Doesn't happen. And JFK actually goes on television. He takes responsibility for the failure of the Bay of Pigs. And the reason it's called the Bay of Pigs is because that is the area of Cuba which they land. But this is really seen as admirable for many Americans. Our president is admitting that he is human, and he's admitting that he made a bad choice, and this operation failed. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev promises to defend Cuba from the USA. This is seen as an act of aggression that is needed to be taken care of. So this just gets even more support for Cuba from the Soviet Union, even more communist support. In 1962, U.S. spy planes reveal nuclear missiles in camps in Cuba. We spy on them using an airplane that takes photos. And these photos are then given to Washington, where they're developed and reviewed by analysts. And they start looking at them, and they're like, well, that looks like a missile, and that kind of looks like a missile, and These look like missile shelter tents, and so they really become concerned that something big is going to happen. If assembled, Soviet ICBMs in Cuba will give the USSR the first strike capability on U.S. targets. And this is very scary because it is so close to us. So if you look at the bottom map, Cuba being in the middle, 1,300-mile radius outside of Cuba, takes out pretty much the entire southeast of America, even the capital of Washington. But if it's an SS-5 missile, it can go all the way up into the Arctic Circle and down into South America. So it really depends upon which missile they're going to shoot. But it could be total catastrophic meltdown in America if those missiles are shot from Cuba. JFK warned he would not allow nuclear missiles in Cuba because this goes against what he believes. He's not going to have it. Nuclear missiles are not going to be that close to his nation. And it's reported that the deployment of these missiles to Cuba is in reaction to American missiles being stationed in Turkey being focused on the Soviet Union. So it's kind of an eye for an eye situation. However, Kennedy is still not going to have it. Soviet ships escorted by nuclear-equipped submarines soon approach the quarantine line, and the world waits for World War III. They're just kind of holding their breaths because JFK sets up a barrier. Or a blockade, because Cuba is an island. So we set up a blockade, not allowing any ships or anything out or into Cuba. And the really important point, or the crucial moment in this crisis, is October 24th, 1962, when Soviet ships bound for Cuba near this line, and an attempt by the Soviet Union to breach the blockade would have likely have sparked a military confrontation that would have escalated into a nuclear exchange. However, the Soviet ships stopped just short of the blockade, so they're not actually violating anything. The tense standoff continues on for another few days, and an American reconnaissance plane is shot down over Cuba. So tensions are really high, everybody's watching, and then all of this is really being negotiated during this through letters and other communications. And on October 26, Khrushchev sends a message to Kennedy in which he offers to remove the Cuban missiles in exchange for a promise by the U.S. not to invade Cuba. The very following day, the Soviet leader sends a letter proposing that the Soviet Union would dismantle the missiles in Cuba if Americans remove their missile installations in Turkey. Officially, the administration decides to accept the terms of the first message and ignore the second. However, privately, American officials agree to withdraw their missiles in Turkey, and U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy personally delivers the message to the Soviet ambassador. This draws this issue to a close on October 28th. So the standoff really ends with this deal. The Soviet ships turn around last minute, and Khrushchev removes those missiles from Cuba after this discussion that's happening. JFK promises the U.S. is not going to invade Cuba and does secretly remove those ICBMs from Turkey. However, the crisis ended as a victory for JFK. Even though it was so close to nuclear war, eventually they get to pull it out in the end, and nobody is worse for wear. On November 22nd of 1963, JFK is assassinated in Dallas, Texas, in Dealey Plaza. This is a very, very tragic moment for the United States and all of the issues that are happening in the country at the time are really overshadowed. So the chronology of events as we know it per the Warren Commission, which was the official government deep dive into what happened, is that Lee Harvey Oswald, a known communist sympathizer, shot JFK from the 6th floor of the school book depository in Dealey Plaza. He then leaves that building on foot. He ends up shooting a police officer named J.D. Tippit and sneaks into a movie theater where he's later found and arrested for Tippit's murder. And it is later discovered that he actually was the person who killed Kennedy as well. However, we don't have a whole lot of information from Oswald because just 2 days later, he is killed by club owner Jack Ruby in the basement of the Dallas Police Department. Just hours after Kennedy is declared dead, Vice President Lyndon Johnson is sworn in on Air Force One. And then after a 10-month investigation, the Warren report states that Oswald was the lone gunman. So that is the official word on the JFK assassination. There are many conspiracy theories that float around about this situation, but in this history class, we talk facts, so we will go with what the Warren Commission has stated. The martyrdom of JFK puts pressure on Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act. Essentially, because of his death, they really want to make sure that one of the things that he's been working on for years gets passed. So Vice President Lyndon Johnson does carry out his war on poverty as well as making sure that the Civil Rights Act of 64 passes, which it does. LBJ enacts his own program called the Great Society with civil rights, medical, environmental, and social programs to help benefit the people of the United States, kind of carrying on the legacy of Kennedy's New Frontier. In 1963, LBJ finishes his last year of Kennedy's presidency and runs for his own presidency on his own ticket. His opponent is Republican Barry Goldwater, who talks very strongly about resisting the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. And especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the American people just are not having that. LBJ wins with his Great Society and his prospects in the broadest series of social reforms since FDR's New Deal. So before we end this lesson, let's take a look at some of the things that the Great Society offers. In education, Project Head Start, which is a pre-K program, Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which offers increased funding and new guidelines for education in the nation. We offer a war on poverty, model city projects, Job Corps, the Equal Opportunity Act of 1964, which is going to prevent discrimination in the workplace, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and many other opportunities. Under the Civil Rights banner, we get the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the 24th Amendment, which helps to allow all American citizens to vote by banning poll taxes or other monetary stipends required to vote. In the environment, he creates the Air Quality Act and the Water Quality Act. He creates the Immigration and Naturalization Act, and then he also creates the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts to help promote American culture. And this really harkens back to the Great Depression New Deal era because these programs really continue to help the United States and help its people even into modern time. This brings us to the end of Unit 7, Lesson 4, and I hope you have a great day.